Hello everyone and welcome back to another Total Warhammer 3 guide. I'm Lord Forant here doing a guide on the Slaanesh faction, specifically the Seducers of Slaanesh. Here's the quick summary of them. They use devotees. They get them by raiding, sacking, looting settlements. They also get them from combat, which is not mentioned here. Disciples, they can summon armies using their devotees. And seduction, they can compel enemy armies to join your army during battles and force whole factions into vassalage via your influence. And we'll get into how to do that in a moment. Some specific mechanics worth mentioning here is that just as starting out as the faction, you get a 20 diplomatic relationship with all factions. This is really good for Slaanesh because it means you're in less wars, except for wars you want to be in. They also get additional tribute from vassals, really incentivizing you to subjugate factions using influence and pull them into vassalage. Your lord gets extra experience each time a new faction's fought in battle, which is kind of interesting. It encourages you to kind of go around the world fighting different factions if you can. Getting seducing units to your side in battle is cheaper as this person, and local enemy leadership is reduced. Okay, here we are. This is the Seducers of Slaanesh starting position. You are in the very top left of the map. You start out with a pretty good settlement here, Palace of Ruins. You start off at war with a Khorne faction here, and then as you go further this way, there are more Khorne factions. Now, if you don't know anything about the Warhammer Lord, Slaanesh and Khorne hate each other, and Nurgle and Teach hate each other. So a lot of this fighting you'll have early aim will be against Khorne factions, which is kind of a problem because their units are significantly better in melee combat. But we'll get into how to beat them as Slaanesh. It's actually not as hard as it may sound. So I'm just going to show you the first mechanic here, which is the battle seduction mechanic. So when you get into a battle, you have this nice little option down here to seduce units. You spend favor, which is important, but if you do, you can spend it and you can compel, usually in this case, one. It depends on how large your army is and other mechanics. By clicking this, we pay 1,800 favor, but this person joins our side for the battle. Now, they don't stay on our side after the battle, but what this means is now if we auto-resolve quickly, you will see that they actually fought in the battle, and they obviously would significantly reduce our casualties if we can start removing higher levels of, like, better units of the enemy. Also, you have three options. You can devour them for healing, entice for devotees, which early on you may wish to do more often than not because getting devotees early on can be quite tricky. And of course, you can get money out of it. Okay, so it's just going to give me all these pop-ups here. So we can ignore that for the moment. We're going to actually move this person into this army, and I can hopefully show you the next mechanic. Okay, so now that this army has... Oh, this province requires corruption. Okay, I'm going to have to jump forward a couple turns to show you this. So be right back and we'll show you Disciple Armies, another very key Slaanesh mechanic. Okay, we're back. So I just had to process to the next turn. So here we are, raised another unit. Another big mechanic for Slaanesh is using their devotees, and we'll get into more about how to use them later. But suffice to say, they have this nice little option down here to summon a Disciple Army. Downside is there's no confirmation, so be careful, because if you aren't paying attention, you go to raise units, you click the wrong one, you're spending 300 devotees, which is quite a lot, actually, for the beginning of the game. But when you do so, you get an army to help you. Now, the army size is partially based off how large your army is and corruption, as far as I understand it. It's basically a free army. Not entirely. It does cost you, if you'll see at the bottom of this devotee chart, it says Disciple Armies. It costs 20 a turn to maintain. Right there. They also don't replenish, and they take constant attrition unless they're in your provinces. But what this does allow is for you to raise armies to help you fight battles. For example, this one right here would be a Pyrrhic victory, which we don't want. But if we bring this up, now it's a close victory, and now if we again go through here and we seduce away probably their strongest unit, all of a sudden we've gone from a Pyrrhic to a decisive victory, and we win. So this is something you want to use throughout the campaign, especially when you're attacking settlements that may or may not have garrison buildings in them, or large cities. It basically gives Slaanesh almost, if you've played Total Warhammer 2 or 1, you'll know the greenskins get wogs. This is kind of like that, except you don't build up to it. You pay a pretty precious resource to get. But it helps a lot because Slaanesh's units, although they're not terrible, they're not particularly good at combat, especially compared with a Khorne army, especially if Khorne has a garrison. You're not going to be able to beat them in a one-on-one fight, meaning one of the first things you should do when playing Slaanesh here is try and get a second lord built up with a full or at least half full army, because you're going to need a full stack with your starting lord Nakari here, along with a secondary reinforcing army to have even a chance of beating most Khorne factions in a one-on-one fight. However, it is important to note that as Slaanesh, being the god of, desire, excess, hedonism, you're not really built for combat. So if you fight a straight combat in this game as Slaanesh, you're pretty much playing it wrong. Now, I will mention, it is not possible if you're doing one of the Chaos God realms to seduce away the enemy armies in the final battle. That's not an option. So you still have, those are really the only 4 or 5 fights you're going to have to fight straight on without that seduction mechanic, which does make it a lot harder for Slaanesh to complete those realms than some other factions, considering their combat weakness. But the ability to raise a disciple army for any battle outside of those realms and the ability to seduce enemy units, you should always try and target the enemy's strongest units, which are usually right behind the Lord, or last in case of monsters or flying units. So play around with it. You do have a pool of roughly 2,000 starting. That even occurs on defensive battles. If someone attacks your settlement, you do have the ability to seduce away one of their units. They are expensive though. Nakari here gets a discount, which is very powerful, to help him balance those battles out. And you can also increase that amount several ways. One way is down here on most lords, their blue track at the bottom. You get Promise of Perfection, which boosts the seduce unit budget by 50%, which is really quite useful for that. The other one I'll mention quickly here is this Slaves to Excess Casualties Captured Post-Battle. This is really good for devotees. So let's shift now into research, because it's a pretty good segue, because there are some researches that will help you with winning and seducing units rather than just combat. There's not a lot here that will give you direct combat, but I'll highlight some of the more important ones. This one right here, Euphoric Dominance, will help you proliferate cults, and we'll get into cults later on. Suffice to say, cheaper of that, it's pretty expensive, so a cheaper number helps. Over here, you've got your combat stuff, but this one's important to note. You lose diplomatic relations with the Khornate factions, but you gain advantages while fighting them. I would recommend you avoid this for some time. It might be tempting to snag this early on, but with Slaanesh's bonuses towards being friendly with people, it's quite possible to ally or at least non-aggression most of the Khorne factions in the game. So only take this if you're going to wipe them out. Otherwise, you'll have more enemies than you would normally. Slaanesh's whole thing is really not fighting equal fights, so you don't want to necessarily do that. Now, this is an important one, these two right here. The Divine gives you relations with other Slaaneshi factions, which is nice if you want to do Confederation, plus they're your natural allies. But the big one here is Mortal Lust. If you use this one, you can get the Warriors of Chaos, Beastmen, and Norska. They'll like you. Basically, you'll never go to war with them. You'll have plus 50 relations with them. It's very easy to non-aggression, trade, military axis, defensive alliance, and even ally them. However, we'll get into why you don't want to defensive alliance or ally any humans, elves, or beastmen factions, which are the 3 factions you can influence later on. So we'll go with that one and talk about it later. So those are pretty important. Getting the Dark Prince's Emanation will help early on. Snagging the Euphoric Dominance will help you proliferate cults, especially early on in the game when that's a big one. But as you get further into it, this is a major one you'll probably want to get early on, the Promise. This is in the military one here. It gives you an extra 50 budget, which is 2,000 to 3,000, which will allow you to seduce more enemies to your side in battles, and more importantly, more expensive ones. Outside of your starting lord, most enemy units are over 2,000 if they're really good, so it's hard to get them on your side. This is another one that's not bad. Some of these final ones that you get are all very solid. Once you get the ability to unlock these, which requires Temple of Decadences, definitely jump over here and snag this one for the cultists, make them cheaper. They're kind of like your assassins, cult spreaders, everyone else. So cheaper use of them will be useful. But the big one is this everlasting gift. Just gives you 25 devotees a turn, which is a huge boost. Get devotees. I found it particularly very useful in the long run. Further down here, of course, these are locked behind techs. These are basically your discount ones. Makes your combat unit stronger, but again, is tough for them. Over here, you get this tree, which requires another technology. This one actually requires... Oh, where the heck is it? I forget where it is. It's somewhere in here. It tells you up at the top, Rapturous Bliss. Oh, right there. Requires Tormented Whisper. And Tormented Whisper is a building, so you're going to need that one. But if you get it, it'll allow you to unlock the final tree, and it's important to grab it because these add just general spells. And Slaanesh's spells are actually half decent. They're mostly damage or weakening spells. As you can see, Keeper of Secrets unlocks most of these spells. This one I particularly like, Shard Slicing. Does a pretty good at damage to people. And then as a final, you can get Keeper of Secrets up. Keeper of Secrets is like one of your best late game units. So you definitely want to head to that. This one here deserves a mention. Reduced devotee upkeep for disciple armies. It's not something you're going to use a lot out of late game, but the fact is you can have multiple disciple armies. They just cost that 20 a turn, so this reduces it by what, like 2 or 3? It's not huge, but it is nice. So those are the ones to look forward to. Ones you can avoid, obviously anything that annoys other factions is worth ignoring early on. This one looks like +1 control would be great. I would actually avoid it for a while. The growth one is nice. This one, Rigorous Chastisement, I would avoid for a little while. Grateful Enslavement is very useful. Slaanesh has trouble with income, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, in terms of how to expand, we're actually going to swap here to a later save that I have on my complete campaign, just so that you guys can see more of the map and where and how to expand. Okay, here we are, later save. So this is 55 turns into it. Obviously, you can see I've expanded quite a bit. You start with the Palace of Ruins. The enemy you start off fighting has these provinces through here, the people you're fighting. And in my advice, you want to take these 4 first so that you can get the edicts unlocked. This one helps a lot with the corruption. Income is always solid. Basically, I really like Slaanesh's cults, or not cults, edicts. This one's nice because it reduces proliferate cult cost. But early on, you're probably going to want to spread the corruption, and then you're probably going to want to flip to either growth or the Dark Desires one here for the cost and income for buildings. Whenever you're going to go hit proliferate cults, which we'll get into, you pretty much want to put this edict on as many provinces as you can just to save yourself devotees. So after you've expanded and taken Blood Mountain Fetid Catacombs, now the odds are when I tested this, the Khorne faction that owned them tended to throw up a garrison building, which made it very difficult to take. That's where you're going to probably want to use a disciple army or a second army just so that you can actually breach and take one of those settlements. Now, don't use devotees like I did on this first battle over at Palace of Princes. Save it because you won't have a lot of devotees to use later on. And having a second small army is very useful. After you've done that, you'll have the ability to expand south here towards the Shifting Monolith. Now, be aware, the enemy tends to march past the Fortress of the Damned up here towards Palace of Princes. So you may have to send your secondary army over here just to hold this In my test games, they tended to siege this while I was taking Blood Mountain. Thankfully, if they send their armies over here, like they tend to do, you can tend to just take Nikari, rush down here, and snag these provinces without too much issue, and then pull them over here, or it over here, or they over here, since they don't really have a gender, Slaanesh units, and use them to crush the remainder of that faction. However, after that, expansion gets slightly trickier. You have all of these wonderful Norska and Chaos Warriors blocking you from the very rich Empire and Kislev lands down here, which would be your natural enemy. However, you will pretty quickly start to border the Exiles of Khorne, Skarbrand, and all that. They tend to attack you, and both of my games, I had extraordinarily high relations with them, and they still attacked despite breaking a non-aggression pact. However, there is a way to tend to beat them pretty easily. As I said, Slaanesh makes a lot of alliances pretty easily. So if we just wander down here and we look at this person, they just, as you can see, have tons of relationships. They have like 75 to a relationship just as almost a default. Plus, if you can get alliances and stuff with them. Don't get alliances, but definitely get non-aggression. But if you are worried about them, what you want to do is you want to flip over to the Legion of Chaos. Now, the Legion of Chaos is a Chaos faction, so they can't be influenced like others will be. We'll get to that. They make a pretty good ally. What did I do there? Okay, there we go. They tend to like you. They get similar bonuses towards you. So my advice is if you're looking for a good ally, non-aggression, defensive pact, alliance, them. Now, why that matters is I found that the Exiles of Khorne tend to really focus their attentions down here. And if you are defensively allied or allied with them when they attack, they tend to come to your aid. The other people that are worth allying are actually other Chaos God factions, surprisingly. The Nurgle factions that start relatively close to you, they tend to really like you. Unlike the Khorne ones, they don't attack you particularly that much. There's no like hatred of you. And it's worth defensively allying you because they tend to take and control the lands that completely surround Khorne. So if he attacks you, you'll have allies invading from all sides. This is the point. This is like 7 or 8 turns after his attack. He controlled these provinces up in here. He's now lost them to the general wave of people attacking him. It's kind of funny. However, and this is another interesting one here. Let me find Khorne. I'm actually allied with another Khorne faction here, Crimson Skull. They actually really like me. These guys just absolutely hate you. They tend to attack you. I guess that's to inspire some conflict. Otherwise, as Slaanesh, you can just happily sit in the corner of the map. You don't have to fight people. But these guys also attacked as well. So now, I'm sure you guys are wondering when I say faction influence and seduction, what that is. Every faction that is seducible, which are elves, men, and beastmen, have this nice little meter next to their lands. And seductive influence goes up as you do diplomacy. So for most Norska factions, they're going to offer you non-aggression and usually military access and trade really early on. That gives you a bonus to just influencing them for the rest of the game. However, and this is something I'm not a big fan of, you cannot, that once you're on a diplomacy screen, you'll see this option above them with the bar as well. And you'll see, if you hover over it, you'll see dominate. For 300 devotees, you can force them to become your vassal. Criteria, they have to reach 100 seductive influence, but they can't already be your vassal or a military ally. So you're better off just getting the non-aggression pact, military access, and then later on dominating them, turning them into your vassal. Because if you remember, this faction gets plus 50% income from vassals, which makes it very useful. And I'll touch on that again, but I will make a point of mentioning when you wipe out the faction that's located in this area, on their final settlement, you'll give them the ability to create a vassal. And you'll see this as you fight periodically you'll be able to resurrect people, similar to what the Chaos people could do in Total Warhammer 2 when they fought Norsca. They could resurrect them. I would advise not resurrecting anybody in these first two provinces. Slaanesh is not the greatest on income outside of using vassals, so having 2 full provinces with edicts on them is still not a lot of money coming in. So don't do it anywhere in your heartland. And when you're invading even Khorne's lands over here, I would probably avoid vassalizing them as well. Instead, focus all your vassalizations on either the Norsca or humans to the far south. Now, there are some criteria for seduction, and the best way to show you guys those is if we come down here and look at the elves of Lorelorn Forest here. You'll see that I am slowly getting seduction on them. That is because you get into the cult mechanic. However, as things go along, they have a racial resistance, and depending on the number of settlements they own, the harder it is to influence them. You can get around this by using devotees and cults. So the first obvious way to build up influence is diplomacy. Hard to do on people that hate you, so there are ways around that. One, you could take a cultist, and the cultists have an ability, as we'll see on the left there, target, settlement, establish cult. For a chunk of change, you can create a cult in their lands. And once you create a cult in their lands, let me pull up. I think I've got one here where I don't actually have it. There we go. You have the ability to build a cult building. You can do this one, this one, this one, or this one, obviously. Now, the effects differ. This one will summon an army near it, and then it'll basically give you a disciple army to attack with. So it's worth bringing a cultist along with your armies if you come across a capital or something you can't take. Just throwing down an excess cult salon in there, triggering the army, and then you can always press the raise disciple army on your own. It's efficient. This is actually saves you devotees if you do it this way rather than raising it on the campaign map, although it does cost you money, and there is a cooldown of 15 turns once you establish a cult. Now, oh bother, I clicked off of it, didn't I? There we go. Now, the other buildings, this one here gives you a cultist hero. So if you really want to quickly expand your cults, this will allow you to keep building up cultists rather quickly. Gives you a small amount of influence. If their public order control gets above 50, you get more influence. So try and do this on people's capitals that are usually really loyal to them, and that'll help. The downside is as your influence goes up, they'll get less stable. So really just use this one if you want to chain build cultists, which is a very viable and good thing to do early on, because establishing cults is a big thing, but be aware it does cost devotees to build, and you don't get a really good return here from using them. Over here you get the excess cult parlor. Now this is probably in some ways the best one to finally seduce and then influence into becoming a vassal, a faction, because this gives temporary diplomatic bonus with them, but also if their income is high. So if we look here at the elves, they have a high income, which means that building being there will give me a 6 influence rather than the default 3. Now, assuming they don't have good control, they don't have influence, and you don't need an army, you are most of the time going to go with this one, which will give you devotees back, make it easier for you to compel armies to join you, and provide 4 influence a turn. In my experience, you're going to build this one like 80 to 90% of the time in random settlements, and only save this one here for rich settlements, and this one for high public order settlements, and this one for armies. Now, there's another mechanic for spreading cults, and I've mentioned it. It's up here. Proliferate cults. It's expensive. It requires a massive amount of devotees. The odds are you're only going to get that level of devotees through missions. Quite a few of your missions here, for example, this one, Confederate, will give you 200. War coordination. Setting a war coordination target will get you 80. Closing a rift will get you 75. This is how you're going to build up devotees quickly in the game. Now, you can do it with buildings, as we've seen through cults. You can also do it with actual buildings up here. And we'll get into the buildings a bit more, but suffice to say, right here, this gives you devotees. The Cult of Agony, it's very useful in that sense for building up devotees. It's not huge, but you're going to want to use it. But when you do proliferate cults, it'll pick random three human or elf-owned settlements in the world, and it'll stick a cult building in them. Now, be aware that pressing this button takes a lot of cultists, devotees to use. But then once they're done, it also requires 250 to build one in each. So basically, you need almost 1,500 devotees to actually build and then fully upgrade the cults quickly. So just be aware of the fact that it is expensive. Early on, you're probably going to get enough devotees that you can use it at least once to spread it. But after that, you're going to have to be getting it from quests, waiting. The big one here is this is where the cultist comes in. A very viable strategy is taking your starting cultists that you get given and in fact running them once you survive the initial wars, which you can use a cult to win on, is sending them down here and sending them by sea all the way down here to the Empire, Elves Province, and Kislev, and just start spreading cults every 15 turns on cooldown. That will actually save you devotees. And it'll allow you to start getting some generation here. As you can see, cult creation gives me some, buildings give you others. Faction seduction is fun though. I mean, the ability for me, given time, to take the Elven province down here, and assuming time ticks up, I'll get them on my side. Be aware that as the suspicion rises, as in your influence, they will get more resistant to you influencing them. So you're also going to need to spread corruption. That's, again, where the cultists come into it. If we can get back to the cultist unit down here. The cultist units also just spread corruption passively, which means in terms of upgrades, established cult, making it cheaper is nice, but really the spread corruption should be a larger focus for you because you want to spread Slaaneshi corruption in their lands pretty much as you can. It's not the easiest thing to do, spread it, mainly because other corruption, any other chaos corruption will reduce it, not to mention each faction's trying to reduce it. But you get 2 or 3 cultists wandering around together, you can very quickly influence people. In my game, when I finished the game, I had it much higher. It was very easy to fully corrupt provinces, influence them, and get them as subjects. I did it with the elves and stuff. Now, that's about it for devotees and cults. Okay, let's talk buildings. So Slaanesh has a relatively terrible economy, I would say, outside of getting tribute from vassals. A lot of their buildings are interesting. So let's look at some of them. So if we look here at the larger development for a capital settlement, first off, be aware that as a chaos faction, you can either have a soul keep or you can have a dimensional tear. They have different effects, so just keep an eye on that. Which one you use is kind of dependent on what they're going to use. Soul keep here is by and large better if you're going to be using it on the front lines. Whereas the dimensional tear here is kind of better for spreading corruption. So just be aware that you do have the options. Your first one starts as a dimensional portal. So I would probably stick with it. But if you're building something or you take a hostile capital, by all means throw down a demonic fortress. The difference in garrison is nice, I will say. So in terms of building, your capital has a unique one, the Court of the Covenant, which is similar with all the other chaos factions. It's a good one to build once you get to level 5. Prior to that, you really don't need it. It'll just increase your relations with the other chaos gods. So Slaanesh is interesting in the sense that their base military building here only goes to level 2. The reason that is the units you unlock, Demonettes of Slaanesh, Marauders, and Marauders with Spears, are pretty terrible. Slaanesh's infantry isn't amazing. In fact, if you look at the Marauders of Slaanesh, it says as their 3rd description, meat shield. It kind of tells you what their job is, to pin down the enemy so you can flank them. And early on, what you're going to want to use is the Demonettes of Slaanesh to a large degree, because they are very fast And they have a interesting trait here where they have devastating flanker. They get double their charge bonus when attacking the rear or flank of the enemy, and their charge bonus is pretty nice. If I can, assuming I can get onto them again, starts out at 20. There you can raise it with lord traits, so 40. That means they're actually pretty decent at side combat. This one up here, the Marauders, which you get from level 2, is interesting. I mean, I found it was better to usually just go with the Marauders of Slaanesh with the spears because they've got good defense, but you could take the whip infantry here and I'll keep that defense going as well. They're really solid. Don't expect your infantry to win the battles for you. You might win through flanking, which is kind of consistent to all the Slaaneshi factions, but that's the way to go. You're more likely to win battles through this line here, where you get Chaos Furies and you get more faster. They're kind of like Cav factions to some degree. They do a lot of damage as well, but almost all Slaanesh armies are glass cannons. So you definitely want to build this. You want to get some of these higher units, which are Shock Cav, just general Cav, flying, which is always useful, and spear Cav as well. So this is Cav, but you also get the flying. It's worth building. Slaanesh's units are really good at flanking. You'll see this one also has devastating flanker, 100 speed though, much better stats. This is how you could win a battle, use them to flank. This one here is unique, but you're going to want to grab it because it unlocks technologies. This is the Temple of Decadence. This allows you to recruit cultists, and it gets you spawns of Slaanesh and exalted demonettes of Slaanesh. That's important because the exalted demonesses are significantly better than the base demonettes of Slaanesh. So you're going to want to get them. Plus, spawns are really solid for all the chaos factions. Slaanesh's are not particularly great, but they do have they cause fear. They also reduce enemies' attack and defense as well. All the Slaanesh factions in actual combat require pretty good micro to use because they kind of all of Slaanesh basically functions as a cavalry faction despite using infantry. When we move here to advanced military, how you want to use this one, this is really good if you're going to put it in a demonic fortress on the front lines because it'll increase the amount of casualties captured, which you can then turn into devotees. Same province, adjacent ones. Not so great to stick back in your capital that you start with because you're not going to catch a lot of casualties. On the other hand, unlocking the chariots. Chariots are pretty nice. They hit hard. They move fast. You're gonna want them, but just don't put them in your backline provinces if that makes sense, unless you're doing it solely to train units. This one in the middle here, you get additional corruption, but more importantly, you get recruit ranks up. And considering how weak Slaanesh's units are, having your units recruited at a higher level is always solid. Plus, this gives you Keeper of Secrets. Keeper of Secrets is quite interesting because they cast spells, and they're pretty good at combat. They're demonic, so they don't flee. You're definitely going to want them on the battlefield when you can get them. They're pretty solid. Level 1s gets you the Fiends of Slaanesh. I found they didn't hold up in combat as much as I liked. It was just personal preference, but I preferred to go with the Cav. This one over here, Drifting Towers, you're going to need it for tech, so it's worth getting and building pretty early on. Increases your recruitment, unlocks Alluruses, and Alluruses are your mages, basically. Slaanesh has some pretty decent stuff. They have the Slaanesh spells, but they also have access to the shadow ones, which are debilitating ones. They tend to reduce morale, attack, defense. As you can imagine, Slaanesh doesn't do a ton of direct damage, but they weaken units so that their weak units can actually beat them. Specifically, the ones that reduce leadership are great to use on the enemy just as they're getting hit by a flanker. You can route some pretty powerful units with them. And as you go up, it unlocks more capacity. I will mention, though, the highest level does give you global recruitment capacity, something that is very useful for Slaanesh because you can only raise 2 or 3 units unless you go down the blue line on your lords and get that. And that's a solid one. Plus, you get Soul Grinders. Soul Grinders are, in my opinion, probably the best units in some ways that Slaanesh can get. They're pretty resistant. They do wounds. They're a solid flanker. They're a monster that causes terror and other stuff. They're worth using Slaanesh is really interesting. They kind of function as a quasi-Skaven faction, and their units are weak. Skaven from Total Warhammer 2. And they need multiple armies to win battles, but because they can seduce enemies, they can get away with having middle tier units, converting the enemy's good ones and winning that way. They're very interesting. You have your garrison building, stick it in your capitals, especially if there's any chance they'll be attacked. It's quite helpful. That's about it. Warpstone Locust, if you stick it in capital building, because the capital has a 50% chance of removing traits from visiting realms of chaos, it'll boost it even higher, plus reduces chances of plague spreading. But if you make nice with the Nurgle factions, shouldn't be a huge issue for them. I never found the Nurgle factions sticking too many bad plagues in my land, unless I was at war with one. But now we get into the more interesting stuff, the infrastructure, earning money. So in a capital settlement, you will have access to different building than you will in the minor ones for this. You also obviously have different defenses and you can't unlock high level stuff. But Slaanesh has these Cult of Pleasures stuff, which similar to how Marathi played in Total Warhammer 2. They give control and corruption. The important thing is if you have a large amount of control in your province, you get a bonus here. You get extra devotees a turn. Which means you want to stick this in your capital and tend to have public order. And you can boost this up to quite a few devotees per turn, control and corruption, plus cheaper cults is always nice. In a minor settlement, however, it just gives control and corruption, but it does spread the control towards adjacent provinces. So in this sense, they've kind of got like the vampire counts from Total Warhammer 1 and 2. They can spread their corruption pretty easily to the neighboring provinces. And remember, as you spread corruption, people's Slaaneshi influence go up. So if you find a really good province, enemy territory, capital, take it, stick a military building it, start spreading your corruptions, you can actually seduce the factions around you that you were at war with. It's kind of cool. Build like one of these in a minor settlement. I built more than I needed in this one at this time, so I destroyed them later on. But the reason I built these here, and you might try it as well if you're worried about the Khorne factions, if you build plenty of buildings that spread corruption in this province here and the other one, you will quickly find that the Slaanesh provinces have massive amount of the Khorne provinces have massive amounts of Slaanesh corruption. And in fact, I've caused the capital of the Khorne faction to continuously revolt against them. Which is completely devastated their expansion. And in fact, when I was playing this, in about 4 or 5 more turns, they lose their capital to rebels without me lifting a finger. Again, Slaanesh, that's how you fight. You don't really send in the armies until the enemy's weak and reeling, and then you attack. So it's worth doing. Helps you with the Khorne factions, making them have to deal with rebellions and be unstable. Otherwise, though, don't build too many of these and get rid of them once you've got good corruption control. Then we get into the actual money-making ones. And so this is a very strange thing. So you've got this building chain here, which gives you income and boost income of buildings in the local region by 50%, which you would think is amazing. But if your control goes negative, it also decreases control further, which means if you have provinces that have negative control, this just makes it worse. So only stick these in provinces either where you want rebel armies to farm experience and money from, which you really don't need to considering the chaos rifts that pop up, or just stick this in provinces where you have a ton of control because it is a very nice boost. You stick 3 of these minor ones, you've boosted the income massively in that settlement. This is your growth building, casualty replenishment growth, pretty normal, pretty typical. Build it early on, get your settlements built up to 5s and then 3s. Keep it for on the front line so you can replenish casualties. You don't have any really good casualty replenishment as Slaanesh, so having 1 or 2 of those in frontline provinces is very valuable. The other one here, and this is again an interesting one. This is your income building, but only when your control is below 50 do you get double the income. So the incentive here is either to make you have really low control in your provinces, where you're looking at revolts periodically, or have high control where you get less income. So low control, more income, high control, less income. But if you build these, you're going to want to build these to boost it so that you actually make money off of them. It's interesting to note the highest level one here, you can only put in capital settlements, which makes it kind of unusual for income buildings in this game. And obviously, if you're here, you can only get up to them as well. In my experience, if you want to make money from Slaanesh, the best way to do it is through vassals. Otherwise, it's build this in each minor settlement, followed by this in each minor settlement, followed by a garrison building. These are all terribly built wrong. The other one here is if you've got like a resource building, in this case iron mining, it gives you devotees, so you want to build it, and it boosts income. Probably replace this chain of buildings with your resource building. Obviously, in this one, I could destroy it. In fact, I did in my campaign when I went further and built that instead. It's very useful in that sense. In terms of units, we kind of already covered it. Let's just touch briefly upon the heroes, and then I will let you guys go. So if we track down one of my armies, which of course I've totally lost. Here we go. Here we go. So in terms of heroes, you have your Alluruses, which are your standard spellcasters. They use Shadow or they use the Slaanesh spells. This is a Shadow one. Stuff like this one, the Withering here, -8 leadership, 30 armor. Great to use on people when you're flanking. Enfeebling Foe, actually, if you use it on the enemies, allows your infantry to fight on par with theirs. So it's very useful, especially obviously if you're flanking. Everything is better when you're flanking, basically. But this will allow your base meat shield units to fight on par with corn units for the 17 seconds the spell lasts, basically. Obviously, if you put it up, you have a longer duration, lasts longer than the cooldown. Very powerful to use early on. The Penumbral Pendulum, it's okay. It's one of your starting damage ones. It's definitely better than this Mystifying Miasma. If you're having trouble winning battles and you want to do damage with magic, boost that up, and it'll help quite a bit, especially against armor units, which Khorne and stuff, they've got some pretty strong ones. Further on, Pit of Shades. This is a very solid one. Wait till your meat shields tied down the enemy, drop a Pit of Shade on the whole battle area. You'll kill quite a few of the units and damage them. Most of your units outside of your flanking units are relatively expendable, so don't worry about them taking damage or dying while in combat, basically. This one, the Mind Razor, use it on Cav right before they hit, and they'll do tons of damage. Or Lords. Obviously, you want to snag Earthling and Magical Reserves. You get more. Arcane Conduit will boost you as well. This is an interesting thing up here, though. All of the Slaanesh ones have Hate Khorne. It boosts your combat ability when fighting Khorne factions. If you go to war with Khorne, use it. Otherwise, don't. You've got your different chariots. They're all differently usable, so whichever is your preference. Training is always very good to snag. Especially on a unit that's going to be in your army all the time, just because better higher level units, especially on Slaanesh, is going to help a lot. So that's it for the Alluruses. If we jump over to Occultist, you've kind of already seen what they do. They're mainly for spreading corruption in cults, but they can also fight, and they can also summon units to the battlefield, which can be quite nice. Give you aid to fight. I tend not to stick them in armies until they become immortal, just because losing them is annoying. But they're decent at melee combat. They build up. They're your standard melee one. I found it better to use them to spread the corruption in cults than help in the armies, though. I think that's about it for that. And yeah, they're a very fun faction, Slaanesh. They're not about combat compared to some of the other factions, which means doing the realms for them is difficult. On the other hand, it means they tend not to get attacked by enemy factions, so you can kind of just sit back, spread your corruption using cults and cultists, and then just be ready for when the rifts pop up, race in turn 1, and you've got the best chance of getting it. I will point out the fact that your seduce enemies work on enemy armies in the rifts. Or the realms, rather. So definitely use them, especially when fighting They only don't work on the final battles, but they work on the minor battles. So by all means, save up money so that you can use them on every battle. It will allow your armies to actually be sustained in the rifts. I was surprised that Slaanesh did so well doing the realms and rifts compared to other chaos factions, just because I could reduce the enemy's army by 2 to 4 units every battle. Still took damage, but a lot less than I would have. So go forth, have fun, seduce the entire world. Just remember, you can only seduce humans, beastmen, and warriors of chaos units and elves. And don't ally people you want to seduce. It can be worthwhile allying some of them in general, but by and large, you're going to want to have vassals. And eventually, if you get vassals, they won't be fighting each other. They'll start swarming south and conquering things for you. All the better for you. And you can kind of just sit back, manipulate things. Given time, Slaanesh can easily become the strongest of the chaos gods. Their influence spreads because of those cults everywhere and worshipping armies. It's very easy to become the dominant chaos god without fighting. It's a very strange faction, very weak. Plays similar to the Skaven, so have fun with that. And thank you guys all for watching this. This will be the end. And I'll see you guys all hopefully in another guide video. Bye for now.